Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 2. I hope your first week was okay. I know it's a lot to get a handle on. You're working with 3 different platforms in order to make this function for this class. So if you're struggling with anything, I hope you came to office hours last night to talk to me. I'll do them every Monday, 5 to 6. But if those times don't work for you and you still have something you want to talk to me about, please email me and we'll set up a time to talk. Also, I suggest everybody check in too with the bookstore if you're having trouble with accessing the Achieve platform. They might be able to help you out. Hopefully, all is sorted though. We're starting our segment on the history of media. So for this first half of the semester, basically, we'll go a little out of order as far as your textbook is concerned because we're working chronologically to look at the history of media as it develops from print to radio to television and film to digital media. This week, we're looking at books and the birth and rise of print media. And I've asked that you watch a documentary as well as take a look at your textbook. It might help you to watch it before coming to this lecture. If you haven't already, though, and you're like locked in for the lecture, don't worry about it. But definitely do watch the film. It's about the birth of the Gutenberg press and the impacts on literacy and culture that comes from people having access for the first time, really, to knowledge that isn't given to them directly by someone, specifically people in positions of power, telling them what they should think and what they should know. So books have an incredibly important history on the growth of so many different liberation movements, and you'll see so much of this as we go through this chapter, but also throughout this semester. So I hope you've watched it, and if you haven't yet, I hope you enjoy it. Great. Let's get into it. Also, I'm a little sick today, so I'm probably going to be off camera for most of this lecture, and I apologize, but I'm here, so if you need me, come find me. Okay, so our book lays out in this nice timeline the prehistory of the book through sort of the early phases of the book. And I'm not going to get super into detail going through this whole process, but important things to know are that originally text was carved into stone or buildings or other things. And so it was not movable. So if we think about sort of the birth of the book, the first phase is really the ease of portability. So the invention of things like papyrus scrolls and early Chinese books and later the codex in Europe, what we're really talking about is the ability to easily transport writing from one place to another. And then the next phase that happens is reproducibility. So whether that starts with the handwriting reproducibility of the codex or the next move being prints that reproduce an entire page at once. So rather than movable type, what you have is a carved surface that has all of the letters and any images that might appear on a single page. The next phase is the birth of movable type. And this happens in China in the year 1000 of the current era. So basically only about 1,000 years ago. And what that leads to is the possibility of being able to easily and quickly remake pages of different things. So I don't need to carve an entire sheet out for each sheet that I'm trying to print. I don't have to carve a whole block. I can move independent pieces around and easily reproduce different things and change what I'm producing without having to have many wooden blocks. And then the development of movable type also happens in Europe about 400 years later. The innovation of the Gutenberg press was not that it was the first to make movable print, it's that it shifted the labor structure. So before the use of these very massive presses to push the type into the paper, that would have all had to have been done by hand, usually by multiple people with rollers. So the printing press is less about the ease of making the print itself as far as like movable print, which is arguably a much bigger revolution. What it is a labor reduction machine. So it takes one person to run that as opposed to multiple people in a shop. So what's really critical about the Gutenberg press and movable type more generally is the ability to reproduce books very easily and very quickly, right? As we see in the book before that, things like illuminated manuscripts, which are codexes, so sewn together pages that had been handwritten, and in some cases incorporated some degree of like woodblock printing. The amount of labor that it took to produce an illuminated manuscript meant that there were very few of them reproduced. And they were typically for religious clerics, so priests and higher ups in religious structures, and also the very wealthy who were patrons of the church. And so the monks and priests that would handwrite the manuscripts, and specifically typically Bibles, would produce special ones for the people who patronized the church, who paid for the costs of that church. And they were very precious objects. They included paints made from precious stones like lapis lazuli for these vibrant blues, and often had a lot of real gold painted into them. So literacy was really limited at this point. It's not just that the book was limited to access and say we all went and looked at an illuminated manuscript and read. It was that very few people had the capacity to read at all. So again, mostly clerics and the extremely wealthy and people who were part of the merchant class would read for the purposes of trade. And that was really it. Other than that, you depended upon your priest to tell you what was happening in the Bible. You depended upon other people to tell you what was happening in the news of the day. People got this information in other ways besides reading. And so the Gutenberg press and the sudden ease of reproduction of books, even just the Bible, had a radical impact and eventually led to the Protestant Revolution. So this is how we ended up with the notion that there should be more of a direct relationship to God, which was the edict of Protestantism, because there was suddenly this notion of a direct relationship to the text that told the stories. So this also then, if you start to imagine what happens at the birth of the encyclopedia and the sudden notion that people have direct relationship to information, is incredibly drastic in a change for how people think about who has power, the rights to knowledge. All of these things change because of the ability to reproduce text easily and in large numbers. So by the mid-1700s, we've got the emergence of encyclopedias. We have a rapidly increasing literacy rate. And then all of this is going to continue to expand more and more kinds of books, more and more literacy. So radical changes. I'm not going to go into the details of different type systems like linotype and offset lithography, but you should look at those in the book because they are interesting, but it would make this lecture way too long. But the thing to think about is that we're developing constantly new technologies to not only reproduce text quickly and easily, but also to be able to reproduce images. And this is really something that becomes really critical to the way that we think about what we'll look at in our next section, the importance of photojournalism and the image to the way that we tell stories, especially about the news. All of these things are expanding, and simultaneously we have the emergence of paperback books, which makes them not only easier to reproduce, but much more inexpensive to produce than leather-bound encyclopedias and precious classics that are slide opened with in the beginning of this. So paperback books become readily available. Literacy continues to spread. But we'll talk in a minute about some of the ways that that becomes complicated as well. So early prestigious publishing tried to identify and produce the works of good writers. They sort of saw themselves as bastions of culture. And many of these, the oldest publishing houses, still exist, but they're under these conglomerate ownerships that we'll talk about a little bit later too. The demand for books grew rapidly between 1880 and 1920 with the rise of industrialized urban culture. So people were in cities, had more access to books, were more interested in reading, wanted more and new books. And the book industry, our book says, helps assimilate European immigrants. What that really means is it standardizes American culture in a certain way, right? It's a way for people to all have access to the same notions and the same books that makes some version of a standardized culture. And of course, what this means is it also is suppressing other things that don't fit into that. We'll get into this a little bit more when we do our week on film and we talk about cultural imperialism, because this is really one of the beginning phases of it is through the book industry. So there's a small dip, there's a slight decline from 1910 through the 1950s in book production due primarily to the wars and poverty. So 1910 is the beginning of the Spanish flu in the United States, which was a pandemic that we don't talk about very much, but there was a radical effect on culture from this early 1900s from the many, many deaths of the Spanish flu around the world, but the United States and urban centers were particularly hard hit. Um, and then immediately following, we have the First World War, followed by the Depression, followed by the Second World War. So it isn't really until the 1950s that the book industry bounces back, when there's some relative degree of stability and economic improvement for the lives of most Americans, though certainly not all. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens with the expansion of paperback books and things called either dime novels, which are these, you could buy a book for a dime, or even before that, penny dreadfuls, which were somewhere between a book and a magazine, that were these cheaply printed, small, serialized stories, often that were really sensational. And then later, obviously, in 30s, 40s, 50s, you have pulp fiction. At each new phase of the expansion of ease of publication and production, so meaning the expansion of who's reading and how much is available, you have certain kinds of social panics over the moral effects of these stories, and then also the potential danger that they pose to the sort of sacredness of the book, right? So they're destroying literature and the morality of young people. In the 19th century, the penny dreadful was a small, cheap comic or storybook, and they often focused on macabre and sensational things. So these are actually our first vampire romance novels. So if any of you grew up reading Twilight or any of those kinds of things, this is exactly the sort of this is the basis for a book like that. And at the same time as this, Victorian novels were also thought to be too emotional for young women and would lead them to hysteria. And it was suggested that they should not be allowed to read fiction. And when you get into the 30s and 40s, the pulp fiction book, which often dealt with things like homosexuality and drugs, and also there were stories of imprisonment. There were all kinds of things deeply sensationalized. So with the expansion of publishing and publishing houses, we're also going to get different kinds of specializations among those publishing houses. So our book separates types of books. It calls it into 4 different categories. And the way to think about this is less about what is the book about than it is about who is the book's audience, and therefore how does a publishing house sort of specialize around it. So trade books are the books that we think of as our general consumption books. So everything I just listed, dime store novels, all of those things. But also most fiction you read, even a lot of advice giving or nonfictions fall under trade books. Professional books target various occupational groups, and they're not intended for the general market. And so they don't even necessarily appear in the same line from publisher to seller. So we wouldn't even necessarily see them in bookstores. And then textbooks, like the one that we have for our class, have their own publishing houses or branches of existing conglomerates. And then finally, religious books and texts of religious importance. So this would be Bibles, Qurans, etc., right? And then also sometimes books that are supporting them. But the majority of what you might think of as books about religion would still fall under trade. So as you can see here, the vast majority of books that are being sold, regardless of format, are trade books. So this includes all of our fiction and all of the other things we were just talking about. And then these two together, higher ed and what's referred to as L-High, that's like lower education, meaning grade school. So this is K through 12 books, textbooks and things like that. And higher ed, so some of the books that we read that are both textbooks, but also academic books that don't appear necessarily to be textbooks are included in this. And then we have the small professional and very small religious books, which is why I wanted to point out before that this refers specifically to religious texts and not necessarily to books about and around religion, because that actually would make up a fairly substantial segment of trade. So as we suggested with the penny dreadfuls and pulp fictions, there's a general sort of anxiety very often about the effects of media, and books are no exception. So the wide circulation of books gave many people the same opportunities to learn that were once available to only a very privileged few. However, as societies discovered that the power associated with books and the printed word, books were also subjected to a variety of censors in an attempt to sort of manage their effects on society. In various parts of the world, some versions of the Bible, Karl Marx's Das Kapital, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses have all been banned at one time or another. So one of the triumphs of the internet is that it allows digital passage of banned books into nations where printed books of that type had been outlawed. There's a difference between what we refer to as banned books and challenged books. So each year, the American Library Association, the ALA, compiles a list of the most challenged books in the United States. A challenged book is a book that has had a formal request put in to have a book removed from a public library or a school library's collection. Common reasons for challenges include sexually explicit passages, offensive language, occult themes, violence. There's a lot of requests for books about homosexuality to be removed, promotion of a religious viewpoint, and racism. So you can see that like the call for books being challenged happens sort of on very different value structures, but always under the sort of model that whoever is making the request imagines that they're protecting children from something. So the ALA defends the right of libraries to offer material with a wide range of views. So they tend not to, they don't really respond to these requests for challenges very often. Obviously, certain libraries and school systems do, but the general opinion of the ALA is not to. Selling books. So the selling of books has changed radically in the past 40 years. Small independent booksellers were initially the way that people would buy books. And the Strand is certainly not small. This is this image that we have here. This is a big bookstore in New York City, but it is independently owned and sells a mix of both new and used books, which was not uncommon in independent booksellers. These were put out of business by large bookseller conglomerates like Barnes and Noble and Borders in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You started to see the expansion of these. And then these were themselves later put out of business, or at least radically reduced in sales, by the emergence of online booksellers like Amazon in the United States and Alibaba in many other parts of the world. So the next step is we had ebooks, and ebooks have made books even more accessible, more transportable, and are more inexpensive to reproduce than previous kinds of printed books. They've also made increased profits for their sellers because they are cheaper to reproduce, but can be sold for proximal costs to printed books. They've also, however, largely reduced the royalties of writers and the publishing houses that work to produce them. Amazon, as one of the largest producers of ebooks at this point now, also has a great deal of control over pricing in the market. Quickly grew to control 90% of the ebook market, which it used to leverage and force book publishers to comply with its low prices, meaning that it paid them very low prices for access to the materials that they were selling, or risk being dropped from Amazon's bookstore, which, as we all know, would be disastrous because I think many people find the books that they want to read through Amazon recommendations. Amazon had also previously already done the same thing to print books. Amazon's price slashing caused most of the major trade book publishing corporations to endorse Apple's model for ebook pricing, in which the publisher set the book prices and the digital bookseller gets 30% commission. So that would mean then that Apple doesn't get to set the price at all. They get to put their commission given to them by a publishing house, so that the publishing house guarantees that not only are they able to continue to produce the work, but that they're able to fairly pay royalties to the writers of the books. When the U.S. Department of Justice ruled in 2013 that Apple and other major publishers had colluded to set ebook prices, denying consumers the lower prices that Amazon could offer, the booksellers responded that government investigations should be more concerned about Amazon. And of course, we're seeing that play out a lot more now as we're becoming more aware of Amazon's labor practices, but also the effects that they've had on the producers of intellectual properties, whether that's books, audiobooks, what have you. We'll talk about this more when we get into the week on the music industry, but you'll see that this trend of, as things become digitally more accessible, the digital sellers have sort of inserted themselves in the middle between the producer of the content, so the musician or the writer, and the necessary steps that have existed in the past. So whether that's a publishing house or a music producing agency, right? All of these things are then sort of interrupted by the digital seller, and they want to take a larger cut. And what's happened is that everyone on this end, the production end, has had their costs and pay radically reduced. And so there's been a lot of conversation about what to do about that, particularly in the music industry, but it's an issue in book publishing as well. As a solution to this, there's also a lot of people who have argued that books should be free. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And so a number of illegal sites have sprung up posting free copies of ebooks. especially textbooks and other academic books, arguing that these should be open source. But before we dig a little further into publishing, the next thing that emerges after ebooks is audiobooks. And audiobooks sort of explode in popularity very quickly from their emergence around 2012 when they start to become quite popular to present day. Audiobooks were once primarily used by those with accessibility concerns. So people who had visual impairments or for whatever other reason were less able to navigate printed text. Audiobooks were a resource for them. And also they were common among niche markets. So fun fact, before the existence of digital audiobooks, there were books on tape, or which is a misnomer because they were often on CDs by that point, that were very popular and were sold in truck stops because truck drivers were among the first to really adopt audiobooks because of long haul driving. But with the advent of platforms like Apple and Audible from Amazon that provided high quality recordings and ease of purchasing and storage, the consumption of audiobooks drastically jumped from 2012 to 2016, and obviously that continues now. Book downloads more than doubled in those 4 years. Amazon owns Audible, of course, the largest provider of audiobooks. Despite evidence showing that audiobooks have really worked to increase literacy and our exposure to textual information, there, of course, remains, as previously noted, people who remain anxious that the audiobook is going to lead to the decline of literacy in America. Amazon is also one of the largest producers and definitely the highest grosser, so they make the most from audiobook sales. There are alternative audiobook sites that are free and volunteer created. So if you think of something like Wikipedia, one of these is LibriVox. It's a long-lasting one, but because they can only reproduce books that are no longer subject to copyright, they tend to be older books that are maybe less popular. It's a great place for finding classics. Also because they're volunteer read and they're, not the familiar experience of listening to somebody who is a famous actor, and they have a lower production quality. But they've been around for a long time as a free resource and are still, I think, a really great one. So even though the book industry is dominated by these large book publishers and one specific large retailer, there are still alternatives for both publishing and selling books. One idea has historically, as we said, been to make books free for everyone. And the idea isn't necessarily a new one. In the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, industrialist Andrew Carnegie used his fortune to build more than 2,500 public libraries in the United States, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, because Carnegie believed that libraries created learning opportunities for citizens, especially for immigrants like himself. And he believed that basically all books should be free. But this was the solution he had, was to help build library structure. In publishing, one internet source, New Pages, is offering another alternative to conglomerate publishing and chain bookselling by bringing together a vast array of alternative and like small alternative and university presses. So these presses that don't belong to these large publishing houses, as well as independent bookstores and guides to library and alternative magazines. So they're trying to counteract not only the limited availability and the idea that books are something we purchase individually, but also bring people into familiarity with things they might not know about, because the algorithm really does limit how much we learn about when we depend on something like Amazon as a way to find out what books are out there. And then finally, because ebooks make publishing and distribution costs much lower, e-publishing has enabled authors to sidestep traditional publishers altogether. So a new breed of internet-based publishing houses, Ex Libris, iUniverse, Hillcrest, and others, design and distribute books for comparatively small prices for aspiring authors who want to self-publish a title, which can even be formatted for iKindle or iPad. And e-publishing is more accessible to people because large publishing houses might be looking specifically for books that are going to be blockbusters, and often young writers or new writers who are looking to self-publish. E-publishing allows people to self-publish books that would probably never reach that degree of visibility. And because of social media sites like Goodreads and others, books which may not appear through the large conglomerates or sell through Amazon still have an opportunity to be shared and talked about by many people. Books and the future of democracy. So just a few closing thoughts. It's important to remember that as text became more accessible for all of us, it radically changed the way that people think about ideas and think about who has a right to access them. It's connected people to new ideas and also to one another. Despite concerns, Pew studies show that we are reading roughly the same amount still of print books. And if anything, if we were to include audiobooks in this, it would show that we're reading more than we ever have, which is good news because it's important for our civic engagement. Readers are more likely to perform charity work. They tend to be more involved politically. Books and reading have survived the challenge of digital culture and managed to still continue to present us with new ideas. However, it's important for us to really think about the effects of large corporate structures and the limitations of what ideas and what books we're being exposed to based on their algorithms and their sales reports. Okay, guys, thanks so much for getting through that lecture. You have a few assignments that are going to be new to you this week. Our discussion board is going to be the first time you're going to be going through the 5-step critical process. It's going to take a little bit of time, so don't wait till the last minute to do this one, because basically I'm asking all of you guys to jump on kind of early and answer a set of questions so that you can all use each other's answers as data for your first example of kind of how to do a small mini study data analysis project, right? So I'm asking you some questions about your print media use, and you guys will then analyze one another's answers to see what that tells you based on this 5-step critical process. So you're going to want to go to that discussion board twice. First to answer those questions, and then once you've answered them, you'll be able to see everyone else's answers, and then you'll be able to work out this analysis. Don't get bogged down in answering this in a long format. I want you guys to get used to this process so that when you do start having writing assignment options available to you for these kinds of studies, it's less intimidating and you've gone through this 5-step process before. And when you do those will be longer format, right? I want like 500, 700 words on those. But for this, you can be pretty short about it. Again, remember, I want this in your own words and your own ideas, so please do not use AI generation for this. I know it's tough, but I promise the amount of time that you actually spend feeding things into AI generators in order to get anything good out of them is going to end up being as much time as it would just take you to just answer the questions on your own. Again, I'm not judging you guys for grammar. I'm not here as an English teacher. I'm here to get you guys to think about stuff. So dig deep, think your thoughts, write them as best as you can, but don't worry about writing perfectly. And then I want everybody to sign up this week, if you haven't already, for your mass media mini lecture project topics. If there's a topic you want to do and you don't see it there, email me, because I love it if you guys have stuff you want to talk about that I haven't thought of in specific weeks. Like, so if you are a gamer and you have things that you want to talk about in gaming, or if you have some interesting insights in digital media or social media that you want to think about that are not listed under any one of those things, please let me know. Just make sure it's something that you can do some real research on. There were a bunch of names in there from my previous class. I'm so sorry. So it looked like a lot more things were taken than actually are. So I went in and I cleared it out. So please go back and double check. Even if you think you signed up for something, please go back and double check, because as much as I was super careful to try not to erase anyone's name from this course, there's the possibility that I may have missed something. So, and again, check it out, see if there's anything you want to do. Here's your full list of everything that you need to do right behind me. So that's your book reading. You'll see the documentary is in that media section. There's also a really fun article on the history of penny dreadfuls and sort of the social panics about them that we have, similar to social media and other kinds of media issues, video games now, that might be interesting to some of you if that was a topic you found interesting. You have only one achieve assignment this week. It's just the learning curve. You're not going to do a chapter quiz 2. And you have the activity board, right, which is our more involved version of a discussion post this week. And then finally, your sign up for the mass media mini lecture projects. We are not going to have any writing assignment options yet. I think you'll have your first one next week when we do newspapers and magazines. You'll have your first option for doing an analysis paper. The rule for analysis papers, and I'll go over this again, is that when you do them, they are not due the week that they are assigned. I write the due date as that week because I want you guys to be working on them while you're thinking about the stuff that you've just read, rather than trying to do one from week 2 in week 12, right? But they're not due right away. I'm fairly flexible on it. It's usually like up to 2 weeks after the week that I'll take them. I just want it to still be fresh in your mind, but those are negotiable too. But I'll go over that again when we start having writing assignment options. All right. I hope that clarifies a lot of things. Thank you so much. I hope you have a good week. Take care, guys. Bye.